Okay, in fact, even though we're both, okay, I should stop chatting now. Okay, so I'm going to put us both up on the screen now, okay, or our names both up on the screen so people can see our names. But I'll wait for a while to start the discussion until we have some people in here. Okay, right now, I think we have some people who can see us live, but they're not officially recorded, okay, as watching. Well, there is actually a comment. Jack Archer, okay, is here. We are up to 9 people, okay, at this point. I will probably wait until we're into the 20s to start formally. Hi, Phil. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Mark Fabian. Hi, Gwilym. Jeffrey, Evan. Thank you all for coming. Hi, Robert. Hi, Dave. Hiya, Jack again. And Linda, hi. She's from Georgia.
Okay. I'm just going to quiet the conversation behind me. I'll be right back.
Okay, very good.
I need you to close the door and not make. Okay, back.
Okay. Well, we have 20 people now, and we have 16 comments. So I think I'm formally going to start the program.
Okay.
If the sharing, okay, is going well, we should be building up into the 50s pretty soon now. Okay. Okay. But the sharing has been very problematic of late because Facebook has been clamping down on people who share and changing, okay, their algorithms also. And apparently trying to eject, okay, a lot of the alternative media, that goes on Facebook. Okay, so good evening, everybody. This is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives on Thursday night at 9 p.m. And my guest this evening is Richard Dien Winfield, who's a candidate for Congress in the Georgia 10th Congressional District. And Richard is a professor at the University of Georgia. He's a philosophy professor, and he has been one for many years now. But he is very well educated in politics, has political experience, okay, working in the Democratic Party for some time, and very well versed in the politics of the time. I think he's very well qualified to run for Congress, and I think we will all see that. His campaign is one that is oriented towards the issues and towards a platform, which when you hear about it, I think you'll agree it's a very exciting platform. So I'm going to take the promo out of the broadcast section now. So Richard and I are on screen together. Okay, and would you like to introduce yourself, Richard?
Yeah, I'm Richard Dien Winfield. I've been living in Athens for the last 36 years. I grew up in New York City, Queens, moved out to Long Island, went to Yale as an undergraduate, as part of the first class that had a majority of public school people like myself. Got interested in philosophy, spent a year studying at the University of Paris. After graduation, went to the University of Heidelberg, did a master's in philosophy there, returned to Yale for a PhD, then kicked around for 5 years in the academic sweatshops of adjunct teaching until I finally got a job down here in Athens at the University of Georgia. When I was in New York before coming here, I met my wife, who was Sujata Gupta from Calcutta, who was in an art class that I attended. And after a couple of years, she managed to make her way to Georgia to accept my proposal. And living here, she became an employment discrimination lawyer, then an immigration lawyer. We raised 3 children. We went to the public schools here in Athens. And when the election took place in November of the year before, I decided it was time to leave the ivory tower behind and step into the public arena and use running for Congress as an opportunity to try to transform political discussion in the nation, as well as in the Democratic Party, and to try to advance what I think are the missing rights that should be stipulated and upheld by our Constitution, but are not. Our Constitution focuses on political rights and civil rights, but it leaves out the rights that pertain to our life as members of families and members of society. And if we can't exercise those rights, we can't exercise our equal opportunity as citizens. So I'm here to take up the struggle to try to make those rights a center of our political discussion. I'm sort of inspired by that 1944 speech to Congress of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he pointed out that in face of modern economic conditions, our Constitution is not complete. We need to add to it what he characterized as an economic Bill of Rights. And I think he was absolutely correct. We need to ensure that we recognize the true right to work, the right of anyone who wants a job to have a job, that we also have to extend the right to medical care, to affordable housing, to education at all levels, and as well access to culture. And I think this requires that our government show itself ready to serve the people by, in the first instance, coming in as an employer, one might say, of last resort when the market fails, and the market will always be unable to ensure that everyone who wants a job can have a full-time job. And I think there are obviously all sorts of goods and services to be provided that serve our communities that the market is not providing. And it's to these tasks that we should give people an opportunity to work. And we can involve people of all different kinds of aptitudes and interests, just as was done under the New Deal with the WPA, the CCC, the Federal Writers Project, and so forth, which put 8.5 million people to work when our nation had less than 100 million people, when the wealth of our nation was 6% of what it is today, when we were in our worst economic crisis. And yet it was possible to make this a reality quite quickly. And I think we want to think of this as not an emergency measure, but as a standing fixture of a just society that ensures that everyone has the economic independence and security they need to take care of their families and be able to function as participants in self-government. So that is the basic plank of this new bold social rights agenda I'm advocating and trying to bring to the voters of the 10th district.
Okay, so let's go further now and go more deeply into the new Social Bill of Rights.
Yes.
Okay, that you advance. And the first of these rights is guaranteed jobs at fair wages.
Yeah.
I'd like you to go into more detail about that.
Well, first of all, I think one has to set the stage by making clear why guaranteed jobs is the fundamental basis of economic independence and security. Because, we know that the market formally allows us to pursue different ways of earning a living. We can, for example, aspire to be entrepreneurs or landlords. To do so, of course, we have to have the capital or credit to do so. If, however, we fail, we're then back in the position of everyone else, because what we have in a civil society in which slavery is abolished, we all at least have recognized ownership of our own bodies and our capacity to labor. So in a sense, that is ground zero of, in a sense, our ability to have a livelihood. And also the market by its own dynamic, the dynamic of competition, requires firms to grow and enlarge and concentrate in order to stay afloat. So it's simply a falsification of the reality of markets to pretend that everyone could be an entrepreneur, or that small businesses are the essential aspect of economic activity. On the contrary, the employer-employee relationship is the key relationship around which our economic and social freedoms revolve. So we have to confront the fact that there are millions of people who don't have full-time jobs. Either they have no job at all, or they find themselves unwillingly with part-time employment, or contingent zero-hour employments, thanks to the explosion of the gig economy. So it's up to our government to step in. If we don't want to leave people facing poverty or being put on welfare in the debilitating position of receiving things and being unable to exercise their own independence and freedom, if we want to avoid those alternatives, we need to have government directly put people to work, and obviously not simply duplicate what the market is already doing. That would only exacerbate unemployment. Instead, we have to offer people jobs in providing those public goods that we need, public goods and services that the market is not providing. And we can discuss what those should be. There was a certain array of what those were 80 years ago during the Great Depression. What we need now is somewhat different. And I think it's worth discussing. What are the kind of things?
I think it's there's a feedback coming from something that I don't know what exactly. There it is. Okay, let me see if this ends up. Okay, can we hear the feedback now? Can you hear me?
I hear you. Fine.
Okay, so you can still hear me. Okay, good. Okay, so let's try this and see if it gets rid of the feedback. Okay, so what I wanted to underline here was the need for a job guarantee. We now have official unemployment statistics, the U3 unemployment statistics, which are at 4%.
Yeah.
And economists like Paul Krugman, something like that, will often say, we're very near to full employment.
Yeah.
We really have to be careful, because if we're not careful, we may start getting into inflation territory soon. And perhaps we have to think about by cutting deficits. And of course, then he employs that specifically to criticize by Donald Trump and the new tax reform bill. Okay. Okay, so when we say that the level of unemployment is 4%, that still means that there are millions of people out of work, perhaps 5 million people, okay, who don't have jobs. But it would very much be a mistake to say that there are only 5 million people who don't have full-time jobs or good jobs, okay, or jobs at a living wage or a fair wage. Okay. It would be a grave mistake. So my question here is, have you tried to estimate how many people, okay, are actually in the category of being unemployed by 1930 standards, as opposed to the current standards, which the government has been working over for years and years and years to try to hide the actual extent, okay, of unemployment in our country?
Well, look, I mean, I mean, I'll say something to that question, but let's keep in mind that even if we were to accept 4% unemployment as the actual figure, and even if we were to accept the argument of people on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum, people like Karl Marx, who had argued in Capital that economic development of profit-seeking firms requires a reserve army of the unemployed, which has to be there in order to allow firms to have a growing labor force when needed. Or those neoclassical economists who say that 5% unemployment is equivalent to really no unemployment because it's impossible for the market to go below that. Well, what are they saying? They're saying that the market is incapable of providing jobs for everyone who wants one. And then the question is, well, do we treat these people like human garbage? Do we leave them without the opportunity to exercise their economic freedom? Do we just put them on the dole and leave them with that indignity? Or do we instead step in and produce what we could call a reserve army of the employed who are doing things that are worthwhile for all of us? Now, to me, it doesn't make any difference whether it's 4% or 10%. Obviously, much more than 4% of our potential working population would want to have full-time employment, but find themselves either having given up the search because of fruitless attempts to do so, or they find themselves with part-time employment or contingent employment, which they would rather not have. So I use as an estimate to think of the so-called costs of this. Let's think of 10% unemployment. And think of 10% unemployment with reference to the 160 million people who are breadwinners. So let's say we're talking about 16 million people who would be put to work in, let's say, severe economic circumstances. And then we have to think about, well, what would we consider to be a fair wage? And I think it's a mistake to talk about a living wage, which will meet the necessities of people. I think we need to think of a fair wage that allows people to participate in the rewards of our growing prosperity. So that means we adjust what could be considered a minimum wage, not just to inflation, but to productivity gains, which takes us to something on the order of at least $20 an hour, not $15 an hour.
Right. Okay. So before we get into the amount of the wage, I still would like to supplement the estimate of, let's say it's 10%.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that I have concerned myself with what is likely to be the true figure. Okay. And the way I make it out is that, U6 takes the figure up, to 11%. But right there.
Yeah.
But then, if we had the same labor participation rate that we had early in the Bush administration, then the labor participation figure right now would not be at 163 million, which is what it is now. It would be at 170 million. 170 odd million. And that means that the level, of unemployment now, what one might call the disemployment figure, is more like between 23 to 24 million. So that is truly a huge number of people that dwarfs the 4 to 5 million that Krugman tends to talk about, or 6 million, that Krugman tends to talk about. So I think that really underlines not just the justice of a guarantee, a job guarantee, and the right, for an individual to have a job, if they want a job, but it also underlines the need, the sheer need of the degree of market failure that we have here. I think you're right to speak of it, as a market failure, because it is a private sector market failure. Because there's no full employment. There are 24 million people who don't have but full-time jobs at a decent living. Okay, so let's get back now to the fair wage versus living wage debate.
Yeah.
Okay, and but please continue on that.
Okay. So let's think about the fair wage as one that doesn't just assure one's basic needs, but also allows one to have what could be considered a fair, equitable share in the growing prosperity of the nation, which means that a fair minimum wage is not just something that's like a basic income. It allows one also to share in the growing wealth of the nation as a whole. So it's tied to productivity gains. And you should remember that when this was the case, by and large, between 1945 and 1973, when wages rose in lockstep with productivity gains, the economy grew at twice the rate it is growing now. In 73, there was a dislocation of this connection between wage levels and productivity gains. Wages stagnated. So that has produced two very pernicious results. Wages have fallen progressively as a share of national income, which means we become a more and more unequal nation, with more and more of the new wealth of economic growth growing to the top, not to the people who contribute so much to producing it. And then on the other hand, this results in economic stagnation, because with more and more wealth sitting in the top, it can't be spent by that 1 or even 10%, sitting in sort of financial investments that are not having the multiplier effect that would be had if we had fair wages, where those who have the fair wage are going to be spending much, much more of their income, putting it back into the economy, than those who are gorging on these great accumulations of hoarded wealth. So I think, in a way, if we have the fair wages, this is also a recipe for a much more dynamic economy, for greater economic growth, with all the benefits that involves. So, and by the way, when we worry about problems of deficits, I think one has to recognize that the ultimate solution to reducing deficits, if we consider that a problem, is economic growth. Not austerity, but economic growth. Because in a way, what matters is not the size of the deficit, but the relation of the deficit to the size of the economy. And if we grow the economy, the magnitude of the deficit becomes of less and less significance in general.
Okay, so I'd like to table that particular discussion of the deficit until later on. Okay, because I think that that part of the discussion can be a fairly profound one, and introduce some new perspectives. Okay, what I'd like to do here is simply to point out that, to ask even, when you were at the Ford Foundation last week, I gather they held a conference on the job guarantee.
Yes.
Okay, and so there you met with a number of other job guarantee proponents.
Yeah.
And some of those were probably from the modern money theory school of economics.
Yes.
Was Pavlina Chernyeva there?
She was there. She participated quite a lot. I spoke with her.
Very good. Was Stephanie Kelton there?
She was not in attendance. She did not come.
Okay, maybe Randy.
Yeah, people who were leading it were William or Sandy Darity.
Sandy Darity, yeah.
Garrett Hamilton.
Derek Hamilton.
Philip Harvey was there. Who's written quite a bit about why the job guarantee is superior to universal basic income. And
yes,
other associates of these people.
Okay, so now I just want to say that from the MMT viewpoint, from the viewpoint of that school, what they talk about, and what I talk about also, is a living wage. But when we say a living wage, there's no real agreement among us, as to what the rate of a living wage actually would be.
Sure.
Okay, now I've been talking about of late $18 an hour,
Yeah.
and also tending to approach the $20 an hour level.
Yeah.
Okay, when I speak of the $18 an hour, okay, I talk about a regionally cost-adjusted living wage, such that the average across the country might be $18 an hour. But in New York City, it might be $26 to $28 an hour, which is, a living wage. Okay, but the point I'm making is that the MMT economists emphasize that when they say a living wage, they mean a true living wage. In other words, it's not, weasel word such that it's better than today, but it's, maybe $12 an hour or 13 or 14 or something like that. But still not enough to have a decent life in the urban areas that, very much of the country actually lives in.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that people who advocate a living wage may actually be advocating a wage level very close to, if not the same, as your fair wage.
But I think it's important to think about the principle that wage levels should be connected to productivity gains. And if you just talk about the living wage...
I think so too.
Yeah.
I think you're quite right about that also. I entirely agree. Okay.
And if we then calculate the costs, I think one has to keep in mind that this kind of a measure very much pays for itself. If we think about what it offsets, all the costs we have by not having it, such as unemployment insurance, such as all the welfare benefits, the dietary assistance, the earned tax credits, and all the other costs of an opioid epidemic, and the lack of purchase power, which the unemployed suffer from, the lack of, if you will, tax revenues that are not there because we don't have large parts of the populace have no income. Think of all the goods and services that people produce by being put to work and their value. I think in many respects, it's not hard to show that it can pay for itself no matter how large the numbers are. But
there have to be some calculations done.
Sure.
Right, because when a job guarantee actually starts, and considering that there might be 24 million people involved in it, if we cost it out at a $20 an hour rate, and we consider a reasonable rate of overhead, we would probably be talking about spending at the rate of, when things start off, perhaps $50,000 to $60,000 per person. Okay, and so when you multiply that by 24 million, it gets to be a considerable amount. But on the other hand, we're not dealing with the static economic system.
Exactly.
So the minute that you start getting 24 million people on a jobs guarantee program, you start to deliver a heavy stimulus to the economy, bringing it into a tight, full employment kind of situation, which then boosts the private sector considerably. So the private sector starts to hire off the reserved army of the now employed.
Yes.
Okay, and so they come off the public spending rolls, and they move to the private sector at a higher wage than the $20 an hour. Okay,
and of course, so this also diminishes the costs of business cycles, of the fluctuations of employment and demand that foster recessions and depressions. So all of that massive, you could say, inefficiency and destruction of assets is avoided.
I agree. But just from the standpoint of the math calculation, if you start off on the job guarantee with a growth up to 24 million people in it, okay, then after that, you have a downslope, and all this would go on in the first year. You'd have a downslope that would be very quick, where there would be people actually leaving the program. So perhaps the average cost in the first year might be only 500 to 750 billion for the job guarantee program. Okay, and then when you factor in
times that, it's manageable. I think
it would seem that it's manageable, but it certainly would be good if you can find some economics consultants to do some calculations for you on that, because you'll probably get some opposition from newspapers and from the mainstream media about how expensive this is all going to be, and that the safety net costs, which are reduced by the job guarantee, are not going to make up for it, and they'll produce all kinds of hokey figures from the Peterson Foundation. Okay, in order to prove this, okay, and you'll have to have your own intelligence, essentially backing up our hunch that the job guarantee is likely to actually be a fairly economical thing to do if we look at all the benefits that are involved, that are opposed to the costs involved. Okay, so I suppose the point that I was trying to make here is that at some point you'll probably have to have some calculations from somebody.
Well, I have some calculations to offer. For example, the cost of unemployment insurance at the peak of our Great Recession was close to $170 billion, and that was for 10% unemployment. If we consider we're dealing with 24 million, so maybe close to 20%, well, maybe not 20%, what, 18%, 17%. We're talking about a cost, if we were to be treating them properly, of maybe $250 billion in unemployment insurance. And there's the earned tax credit offsets, which are probably over $100 billion. The value of all the goods and services provided. And after all, we can have people providing such things as free childcare, free elder care, providing, of course, broadband for all, green energy everywhere, affordable housing, etc. I mean, when you talk about the need to think of a regionally adjusted living wage, you're presupposing that we do nothing about our housing crisis, about the costs of the services people need. Well, we can completely transform those costs with the other aspects of a social rights agenda, where we addressed what would be involved in allowing health care to be a right, affordable housing to be a right, access to education at all levels, a right, etc., and legal care to be a right. And that's something I'm advancing. The idea of a single-payer legal care system covering all criminal and civil legal representation. We think of all of these things, the background situation changes as well.
Yes, it does.
But we can discuss it.
You talk in your platform about how we improve our public services.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you tell us some more about that?
Well, for example, let's take healthcare, which obviously is a major concern. It has to be a major concern, since we can hardly exercise any of our rights if we're not healthy. There's a recognition that a private insurance system is not going to be sufficient to give universal coverage and to allow healthcare to be affordable. Obamacare retains private insurers. It doesn't cover everyone. It doesn't have a sufficient way of keeping costs down. A single-payer health insurance system, I think, makes sense, but not Medicare for all, if we think of it literally, because the Medicare system, as well as Medicaid, still has co-pays, still has deductibles, still does not cover everything. So there are many people in our country who are on Medicare or Medicaid, but they can't afford to use it. Because there are many people with private health insurance who can't afford to use it because they can't afford the co-pays and deductibles. So we need...
Yes, very true, but you're also not... when people talk, of Medicare for all, but these days, they're often talking of HR 676, but specifically, which does replace the Medicare program, and the Medicaid program, and which also specifies no copays, and no deductibles, and covers chiropractic, and mental health, and dental, all those things.
Well, that is something I can endorse.
It's what you mean by super Medicare, right?
Yes, yes.
So sometimes the Medicare for all terminology is actually referring to something like that, which is more similar to your super Medicare for all.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think we want to think of an approach to, we have to think of our housing crisis, and we have to ensure that people do have a decent place to live. And that means also having the utilities they need, including broadband, to be able to function and exercise their freedoms on a par with others. So I think that we need to eliminate the fear that so many people live under of having utility cutoffs, of being evicted or foreclosed because they don't have the money to pay services. And I think we can have a complete moratorium on any such events by having mandatory repayment schedules. And these become feasible if we have guaranteed jobs at fair wages and equivalent replacement income for the truly disabled or people who can no longer work. But then you have the steady stream of income, which can be drawn upon, so that no one need suffer homelessness or living in an apartment that has no heat or electricity or water or broadband or whatever. So I think that's one aspect of dealing with our housing crisis. Similarly, with regard to access to education, we want to ensure that irrespective of your wealth or the wealth of your community, you're going to have access on a par with others, decent resources. So we have to ensure that the funding of public education is not so divergent from community to community, based as it is upon real estate taxes. We need to ensure that equivalent resources are directed to every student, and that we, are going to ensure that class size is reduced, teachers are better paid, better qualified. When we go to higher education, we should ensure that anyone who is qualified to go on and wants to go on should be able to do it. There should be free tuition at all public institutions. Plus, there has to be a living stipend. My father, once upon a time, was admitted to City College in New York City, which had free tuition. But he couldn't afford to go. He had to work. He had to support his family, his parents, etc. My mother went to Hunter College. She somehow managed to do it, but he could not do it. We need to give everyone stipends so that we're full-time students. I think we also have to think about a legal care system for all, because money still affects our legal standing. We're not all equal before the law. And our Constitution gives us a right to legal representation for criminal cases. The way that's implemented is not equal, because if you have to rely upon legal aid lawyers or court-appointed attorneys, they're not given the equivalent resources that someone who's wealthy can have with a private lawyer who's well paid. And then, of course, we have no guarantee of representation for civil cases, which obviously deal with very crucial aspects of life. How can we protect ourselves against sexual harassment, discrimination, corporate abuse, if we can't have civil representation? So I think we can think of a single-payer legal insurance fund where you have complete choice, as you should in a single-payer health system. You go to any lawyer you want for personal, criminal, or civil representation and advice. And it's paid for by this insurance system, which would negotiate fair rates, just as the single-payer healthcare system would negotiate fair rates with healthcare providers. And then we could be in a position where we're largely equal before the law. We also have to abolish bail. Yes, the bail system, which only operates in two countries, the US and the Philippines. And it's in the Philippines because they were our colony. That means that people are in jail because they don't have money to get themselves out, to buy their way out. That's hardly justice. Let's abolish bail, as well as, of course, abolishing for-profit prisons, which have an obvious conflict of interest with the doings of justice. So there are a lot of things in our legal system that we need to transform. And I think, of course, guaranteed jobs are a key to ending mass incarceration. Of course, we have to think about legalizing all personal drug use as well. We need to think of ending the greatest vote suppression in our country, which is taking away the inalienable right to vote from prisoners and ex-felons. That should never be done. It isn't done in other countries. If I were a candidate in Holland or Norway, I would be going into prisons to campaign because the inmates have the right to vote and they are our fellow citizens. So I think that's an important thing to think about as well. And we know, of course, who are losing their right to vote most of all. Disproportionate number of minorities.
Right. Okay. So speaking about some of the responses, that you're getting, when you talk to people about a super Medicare for all, or actually extend super Medicare to all, what kinds of responses do you get from them?
I haven't had anyone object to it, really. I mean, I think they recognize.
Do they ever talk about how much it would cost? Are they worried about that?
Well, what I explain is that, we all know that we pay about $10,000 per person on healthcare. Every other developed nation spends approximately half of that, and yet they cover everyone. Their people are in much better health than we are. They're not suffering declining life expectancies, as parts of our population are, through opioid addiction and other things.
Yes, exactly.
The key to reducing costs is the fact that with a single-payer healthcare system, first of all, you eliminate all of the extra expenses of a private insurance industry, which spends extra money in the overhead of advertising, of paying dividends to investors, of paying CEOs huge salaries, the expenses of administering all of this cornucopia of different insurance policies. We all know you walk into a doctor's office, they have to have a huge clerical staff to deal with all of that. And then we would be in the strongest position to negotiate as one with pharmaceutical companies, healthcare providers, to get costs in a reasonable rate, as is done in other countries. I mean, why should we be paying any more than people in Canada pay for similar services? So we could cut the expense in half through such a measure, at least, as well as eliminate.
So you would say that since the figures that we get, the estimates we get right now for what we're spending on healthcare, $3.4 trillion a year, you're suggesting that we could actually cut that expense down to $1.7 trillion a year.
That's what every other developed nation has done.
And since the federal and state governments now combined are probably spending about $1.7 to $1.8 trillion per year, what you're saying is that it won't really cost our governments collectively anymore to shift to a Medicare for All program. And there would be no more payments by us to insurance companies or out of pockets for copays, and for deductibles. So what you're saying is that a super Medicare for All program, in terms of your estimates of things, would put $1.7 trillion back in the pockets of the 326 million people of this country.
Sure.
In other words, that's one way to look at it.
Another way of looking at it, too, is that because we are the one nation in the developed world which does not have these universal public guarantees, the place where we have tended to have any of the benefits that are recognized to be rights in other more enlightened nations is in workplaces, because employees through their unions have fought tooth and nail to get healthcare benefits, to get retirement benefits, which employers help contribute to. Well, besides we, the general populace, not having to foot double the bill for healthcare, we relieve enterprises, entrepreneurs, of having to pay for part of the healthcare costs.
Yes, and we make them more competitive with the entrepreneurs of other countries.
Think of our auto companies in comparison to European and Japanese auto companies. It's not so much that our salaries are out of line with competitors, but the healthcare costs that the companies bear and pension benefits that the companies bear put a burden on them that makes them uncompetitive. Right. That can be eliminated. And that applies to small businesses as well as large businesses. So when people complain, well, how can a $20 an hour wage be paid by mom and pop stores, as if there are that many mom and pop stores? Think of the way in which not only would everyone have more income, more buying power, employees would have less turnover since they would have enough to live on decently. But in addition to that, if we think of these background measures, entrepreneurs would not have to bear the expense of all these extra benefits, which should be fundamental social guarantees.
Yes, very, very true. Very true. Okay, some of the economists who look at a Medicare for All program will grant that all those savings are there. But what they might say, okay, at least what I've heard a couple of them say, is that a transition to Medicare for All might be a deflationary event because what was formerly spent into the economy, the $3.4 trillion, will now be reduced to perhaps $2 trillion or $1.7 trillion. And so the implication of that is that unless we compensate with other spending, then this might be a deflationary event. Okay, now I don't want to express agreement with this. I'm actually quite skeptical about it because there was an econometric study done by the California Nurses Association, which is now the NNU, in 2008, I believe, if I recall correctly, which showed that what a Medicare for All program would do would be to provide a net gain of 2.4 million jobs if it were implemented into the economy then. And what they had in mind then was the current version of H.R. 676 in 2008. Okay, so that was the result, of that particular study. I've never seen, the economists who talk about a deflationary event actually address that particular study and what it had to say. Okay, but anyway, I doubt that it would be a deflationary event. And the reason why I doubt it is because I'm not aware that any part of our healthcare spending by the government, at this point is actually deficit spending. So the way I would phrase it is, whatever we pay into our governments for healthcare spending in taxes comes out of our pockets. And what we pay to insurance companies and what we pay in the copays and deductibles also comes out of our pockets. So the $3.4 trillion is really going from private sector pockets to private sector pockets, even though the government is an intermediary for part of it. Okay, so it's a case of redistribution of income within the private sector from some pockets to other pockets. And the health insurance companies seem to be an extraction mechanism to take the net assets, of people and pull them up to the more wealthy people in the economy, they're basically a redistribution mechanism that exacerbates, the inequality problem in our country.
Yep.
So it doesn't really seem to me that keeping that 1.7 trillion that you talk about in the pockets of those people who have been paying the healthcare bills will be a deflationary event at all. It seems to me that's going to liberate an awful lot of high multiplier consumption that was not there before.
I mean, think of what is the biggest source of personal bankruptcies: medical bills. Think of all the people who are choosing between buying food, paying their rent, or paying for some medical treatment.
Right, so or paying mortgages.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking about, it as you suggest, it's wealth that will be spent overwhelmingly, and I don't think one has to worry about deflation. And if we have guaranteed jobs and full employment, and everyone having a steady source of income, we're really protected against, the ravages of deflation or even inflation for that matter. I think it's not something we have to worry about, especially if these wages are going to be adjusted for inflation and productivity.
Right.
It's kind of moot.
Okay, but I wanted to ask you that question to give you a chance to practice, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have another major element of your platform that's called enable people to balance family and work. Could you say a few words about that? Because I think that's a very important one.
Key problems that this addresses is the continued difference in wealth, income, and positions of power of men and women. And this is there despite the fact that we've had 50 years of an equal pay for equal work law, one I think was passed in 1963, and where the interpretations of the 14th Amendment have more or less led to a situation that's equivalent to the passage of an Equal Rights Amendment that applies not just to race but to gender. So in other words, despite the fact that any legal discriminations on the basis of gender have to a large extent been mitigated, there still are these pervasive inequalities between men and women. And I think the real key to why they persist lies in the failure of our structuring our livelihoods so that we are able to earn a living and advance our career and at the same time take care of our family responsibilities, which disproportionately fall upon women, first because of the fact of birth and care for infants, nursing of infants, but also the fact that 83% of single parent households are led by women. About 2/3 of the family members who care for elders are women. So a disproportionate amount of caretaking is taking place. So if we want to eliminate the burdens that represents in terms of economic and political participation, we have to do two things. First, we've got to ensure that employers are required to give generous family paid leave for any family emergency. We should have at least a 9-month paid parental leave when a newborn comes into the world. And we have to have decent paid vacations, at least a month, as every other developed nation has. So we have time to spend with our family. And so that we can take care of family members. But of course, there's still the problem of the expense of childcare and elder care in particular. And these are unaffordable for many people. And elder care, as we grow older as a population, I think it's not unrealistic to see, as I saw with the case of one of my parents, needing 24-hour care for several years at the end of my mother's life. That's the equivalent, obviously, of employing 3 people simultaneously. So we have to think of how we're going to make it affordable. And I think the way we can do that is through free public childcare, free public elder care. And if we want to eliminate childhood poverty, we need child allowances. Because just having guaranteed jobs and fair wages does not deal with the issue that the number of your dependents has an influence upon how much money you need to support them. So if you want to really eliminate childhood poverty, we need to have generous child allowances. I'm suggesting $500 per month per child on top of everything else. And I think if you have these measures in place, together with guaranteed jobs, fair wages, and we've left out a discussion of employee empowerment, which we should turn to, but if we have all of this together, not only are we in a position to eliminate the differences in opportunity facing men and women, but we're able to really have true reproductive freedom, where the choice of women turns out really to be equivalent to what is genuinely pro-life. And I can explain that in the following way. Obviously, if you want to ban abortions, you're not ending abortions. You drive them underground. You not only allow for the continued destruction of fetuses, but thousands and eventually millions of women are maimed or killed because they have to go underground to substandard medical treatments. That's particularly true of poor women. On the other hand, if you want to acknowledge the reproductive freedom of women, that's not a matter of just giving them the right to abortions, because women are still stuck in circumstances they would not choose, where they have unwanted pregnancies on the one hand, and they have situations where they want to have a child, but they are worried about bringing it into the world because they doubt that they can afford to have it and bring it up. So on the one hand, through super Medicare for all, we guarantee to all women free contraceptives and day after pills, so they don't have unwanted pregnancies. And through guaranteed jobs, fair wages, paid generous family leave, free daycare, free elder care, we ensure that no woman is in a situation where she can't afford to have the children she wants. And if that's the case, if women really can exercise true reproductive freedom, we have eliminated abortions to the minimum possibility there can be. This is really what is truly pro-life, is to truly recognize reproductive freedom. And I think the pro-lifers are completely missing the ball and not seeing this.
Yes, and this I think so too.
Depends upon this background of all these, let's say, social rights.
Okay, when you explain this to people while campaigning, what kinds of responses are you getting from them?
Frankly, that people are very enthusiastic. People don't reject these views. I mean, I think they find it all very compelling and convincing. And if anyone says, well, what about the cost? Is this really practical? I think one can say, first of all, most of these measures have been implemented in other nations or in our own at one time, in a large measure. It can be done. We are the richest nation in human history, both in terms of wealth and national income. We have everything we need to bring these measures into effect, except the political courage to do so.
Yes.
And I think one can make a compelling case for that.
Okay, I think so too. So you wanted to talk about leveling the playing field between the employer and the employees. I think that's a very important element of your platform.
Yeah.
Please address it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, even though, in a market, every economic transaction involves elements of reciprocity, where, for example, a worker does not steal anyone's job, as immigrants are charged to be doing. You can't enter the employ of someone unless they agree to hire you. There is this reciprocity. But on the other hand, the dynamic of the market of competition requires firms to grow in order to succeed against competitors. And that means they have to take on employees. There ends up necessarily being far fewer employers than there are employees. And that difference involves a difference in opportunity and economic power.
Yes.
And this becomes intensified through globalization, development of multinational corporations that have the flexibility of moving operations anywhere they want. It gets intensified through the advance of the gig economy, where now through the internet, smartphones and the like, employers can get rid of the cost of the overhead of offices and factories and farm things out to people anywhere in the world for as little time as they want. All of these things put workers in a much more unequal position. So
Yes,
I think
they do.
we need to balance the playing field. I'm not saying that the proletariat has a universal interest that is privileged over all others. Marx argued that when he was a young man on the basis of employees supposedly having no property, but Marx himself recognized that employers do have property. They own their own labor power, minimally speaking. They have a particular interest. They do have a particular stage in civil society. It's particular. It's not universal. What's good for the auto workers union is not necessarily what is good for the nation as a whole. But one should not privilege corporate power or corporate interests. So we have to even the playing field. And I think there are two ways of doing that. One is to deal with the dominant structure of enterprises, which is public shareholding enterprises. And that's become dominant simply because that's the form of organization that allows corporations to have access to the greatest capital, which they can get. They don't have to have costs of borrowing. They just get investors to buy into the company from anywhere in the world. And that gives them the most capital with which to compete. But the way it operates in terms of the controlling board of directors are elected by shareholders. Employees have absolutely no say whatsoever in all the fateful decisions about outsourcing, how automation is introduced, what role the corporation plays in political life, how the corporation deals with the community in which it's operating, etc. So we should do something that has been done elsewhere, namely allow employees to have a fair share of governance of public shareholding corporations by putting half the seats in the hands of non-managerial employees elected by their peers. And that will transform corporations from within. They no longer will make with impunity the decisions they do in terms of outsourcing or introducing automation in a way that is not good for anyone. They'll no longer be able to pay their CEOs 300 times what the average worker is paid. They will not influence the political process in the way they're doing. But then there's the other side of it. I've been an employee for more than 35 years at the University of Georgia. I'm in a state that has the so-called right-to-work law that not only prevents unions from collecting dues from all employees in a union shop, but it also bars public employees, state employees, from having the right to engage in collective bargaining. Well, we know the union movement is at its weakest point in our lifetimes.
Yes, we do.
Employees in the private sector unionized, maybe 10% in the public sector. And the conditions are such it's extremely hard for the labor movement to extend its percentage of representation. So I think we need to do it as citizens. We need to require all workplaces with multiple workers, including part-timers or contingent workers, to have mandatory collective bargaining with the elected representatives of the employees, who could choose to join an existing union or set up a new one. But I think this is crucial to evening the playing field between employer and employee. And I think this together with guaranteed jobs and a fair minimum wage will transform our society, will put us in the position to abolish poverty, eliminate poverty, really begin to eliminate that intergenerational disadvantage that afflicts African Americans and other discriminated communities. And I think all of these are fundamental game changers. And nonetheless, are very
easy. I think so too. Yes, I think so too. Now, you earlier mentioned establishing a single payer program for legal care.
Yes.
Yeah. And I find that another way of empowering not only workers, but all individuals as well. Yeah. Could you go into detail on that, please?
I mean, for instance, think of the Me Too movement, which has largely highlighted cases involving celebrities or people who are in the public eye and where it's possible to make use of publicity to try to correct the situation. But most cases of sexual abuse, as well as of discrimination in general, take place out of the public eye. And the victims are not guaranteed any right to representation, legal representation. So they don't have the resources to go to court to protect their rights. And they're often dealing with victimizers who are much more well-heeled than they are. So I think if we want to really even the playing field in our legal representation, we have to guarantee that everyone has legal representation of their choice of any lawyer, not only in criminal but civil cases. And if you take the single-payer model, that offers you the most choice regarding who you're going to appeal to represent. You go to any lawyer, just like you go to any doctor under a super Medicare for all system. And the rates are paid by the social insurance, and they're negotiated nationally as healthcare costs can be. And you lower legal costs. On the other hand, more people can use the legal system, so it will be beneficial to the legal profession, even if the rates may be more affordable. So again, I think it's something that is a win-win situation for everyone. And it's something that has been ignored. This is something I haven't heard others talk about.
Yes, this is something I haven't heard others talk about either. Okay, and I think it's a wonderful proposal. I think people have to realize that that most of us, most of the 99%, operate at a severe disadvantage when we receive unfair treatment from corporations in particular, but from government as well.
Yep.
And the reason why is that it is expensive. How many wrongs have you, I'm not speaking of you in particular, but you in general, how many wrongs have you refused to contest?
Yeah.
Have you let simply go by because it might cost thousands of dollars in legal expenses to right those wrongs? And the reason why the wrongs take place in the first place is because the people who are acting in a way that is unjust to those they deal with very well know that people can't afford to contest this in a court of law, even in cases where the law is on their side. How many people were able to contest the mortgage frauds that were perpetrated upon them by the mortgage industry?
Yep.
That was going on wholesale for years and years and still goes on,
Yep.
I think. And people don't really have the money to contest it. Yep. And so hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people, lost their homes in the crash, of 2008. Because of illegal procedures being followed by the mortgage companies. The robo-signing that took place at the time. The documents that were fraudulent that were brought into court and were not contested by anybody else. This kind of thing really levels the playing field and makes our society much more democratic. Okay, so you also have, as planks in your platform, comprehensive immigration reform. You mentioned also guaranteeing affordable housing, guaranteeing quality education for all. You're a proponent of having internet access be guaranteed and affordable for everyone in all rural areas and be net neutral. Also, net neutrality enforced. And of course, you're very interested in safeguarding the environment and stopping climate change. But I wanted to ask you before we end about two things in particular. Okay, and you're very welcome to come back fairly soon if you want to continue the discussion of the other planks of your platform that we're only able to touch on here. But the two things that I wanted to mention, but before we end, is instituting campaign finance reform.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you intend to do that with the Supreme Court blocking the way?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there are other sides to the problem of campaign financing, besides the huge influx of corporate money into the political process to influence it, to, in a sense, give privileged political clout to the great financial interests. I think there is a little money problem. And to some degree, I face that in my own run. I'm an employee, a state employee. And by law, I'm required to go on unpaid leave before I declare myself officially as a candidate. I did that at the beginning of January. So like employees in general, in running for office, one gives up one's income, one gives up the benefits one has in connection with one's job. And for most people, they probably lose the opportunity to get their job back at the end of the campaign if they lose. In my case, I'm able to go on unpaid leave so I can get my teaching position back at the end of the day if I lose. But nonetheless, I think this is a huge obstacle. We supposedly all have the right to run for office. But materially speaking, it's no accident that our congressmen and senators are almost entirely independently wealthy or self-employed professionals, lawyers, doctors, etc., who can retain their income while they run and go back to their professions when they're over. But you have hardly any people who are doing what 98% of the population is doing, working as an employee for others. So I think we have to think of having a campaign finance reform that ensures that anyone who's running as a candidate is given financial support to meet their living expenses during the campaign, and that they have to have the guarantee of being able to get their job back at the end of the campaign.
Okay.
And then, of course, look, I'm a candidate. I'm not well known yet. Maybe this program will make a little bit of a difference, but I can't rely upon unsolicited contributions coming my way to finance the operation of the campaign. I have to spend an inordinate amount of the time calling up people to ask for money. We could think of an entirely different electoral system, like you have in many other countries, where the government funds the electoral process, shortens the campaign season, and guarantees that the media give every candidate extended time to present their platform, argue their points, ensure that all of the population has an opportunity to see all these things in detail, not in sound bites, not in the way in which TV advertising operates. And that way, we don't have to waste our time fundraising. We can concentrate on discussing the issues. And the discussion will be made available to everyone. I think those are aspects of campaign finance reform that can take place even with a Supreme Court that defends the current decision on Citizens United. I mean, there are other things that need to be done as well.
Right, but you have as a plank,
yeah,
in your platform specifically overturning CU.
Yeah, well, I mean, look,
how would you do that?
Well, look, there are two avenues for doing that. One is to have a constitutional amendment to do just that.
Okay, that's but that would likely take what 7-8 years.
The other thing is to ensure that the composition of Congress and the presidency changes, and that one has an opportunity to appoint people to the Supreme Court who are committed to overturning Citizens United. That too may take time, but I'm afraid...
yes, it may not take as much time as the amendment, though, okay, because I think basically right now we're in a 5-4 situation in the Supreme Court. It is possible that by 2022 or 2023 that it might be 5-4 the other way. And so it might be possible to overturn CU then. However, even before then, it would be possible to pass new campaign finance laws that used Article 3, Section 2, but to prevent the Supreme Court from having jurisdiction over those laws. So could not subject them to judicial review. That's perfectly constitutional. Okay, it's in Article 3, Section 2. Yeah. So the question is, would you pursue that kind of effort to overturn the effects of CU?
Yeah. I mean, one thing we have to think about is the whole issue of whether we have proper, I mean, we call it balance of powers. Another way of talking about it is proper authorizing power. So that we don't have, unilateral, unchallenged supremacy by Congress. And in our Constitution, the authorizing power is in some way limited because the president, of course, vetoes legislation, and that can be overturned. On the other hand, because the Supreme Court only acts on matters that are brought up to it, it's possible to imagine a situation where laws are passed that undermine the very, as you're saying, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court itself, to make it impossible for the Supreme Court to enter in. So I think we have to think about our whole constitutional structure in a way. And ensure
I agree we have to think about our constitutional structure, but I'd also point out that in connection with what the framers actually did, is they did not grant the judicial review power to the Supreme Court. Sure. That was read into things by John Marshall after the Constitution was passed, but they did have Article 3, Section 2 written into the Constitution from the start. They did intend the Congress to have the power to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Now, I'm not aware of its ever using that power. Yeah. Okay. There may be one or two precedents in history, but certainly it's written into the Constitution, the power could be used, and it seems quite clear that the Supreme Court has overstepped its bounds in evaluating corporations as having the same rights as individuals under the Constitution.
I mean, I myself, I don't think that's the crux of the problem, because I don't think individuals have the right to use their wealth to disproportionately affect their political influence. So I don't think it matters whether corporations are regarded as persons or not. Persons themselves should not have that.
Yes, that's right. Okay, I think that's true, but from the standpoint of CU, of the specific legal issue, of CU. That's based on the idea that corporations are people. Yep. Yep. And it rather deliberately wipes out the distinction between artificial people, people who are legal constructs, and people who are born biologically as people, and to most of us, that seems outrageous, just totally outrageous. A pure legal construct and an arbitrary legal construct having no basis in the Constitution whatsoever.
Well, I think we can discuss it more. I mean, right. I mean, the status of person is equivalent to being an owner. That's different from being a citizen. So
yes, it is.
So I think it's important to recognize that no citizen should have the right to use unlimited amounts of their money influence the political process. And as you know, candidates are entitled, irrespective of Citizens United, to put as much of their own money into an election race as they want.
Yes, and that's a big source of inequality.
Yeah, yeah. And that needs to be countered.
Okay, so the last issue I wanted to get to tonight was you wanted to finance all the above by shifting the burden of taxation onto those who are most able to pay. Okay, and I have no objection. I shouldn't even say that I have no objection to taxing the wealthy. I think we ought to do so, and very heavily, because of the threat their wealth actually represents before democracy. We've basically been giving our democracy away to wealth by not doing something to neutralize the accumulation of wealth, okay, and its use in politics. So I'm all for heavy taxation, but I have to point out that as a matter of fact, given the way the banking system operates, our tax revenue does not pay for federal spending. And the reason why I think that is because, as a matter of fact, the tax revenue that is gathered by the federal government is destroyed by the Federal Reserve in the course of its operations before that money ever gets to the Treasury spending account. Okay, so that basically the way that account gets filled is through the appropriations of Congress and through the Federal Reserve creating new money out of thin air to fill that account. Okay, now it's true that we tax a considerable amount. Okay, along with that, that taxation is very important. It performs lots of functions that are very important for government, including draining away funds from the private sector that would cause inflation. Okay, so as an inflation constraint, taxing is extremely important. Okay, and of course there are a number of other functions, such as attempting to moderate the threat to democracy and discouraging undesirable behavior, of various kinds. Taxes do that, but just as a matter of the operations of the Federal Reserve, and the financing system in the federal government, neither tax revenue nor bond revenue actually funds federal spending. So your section on how we pay for it all is not really accurate from the standpoint of the facts, of federal financing. And it also creates a political problem that we progressives have been grappling with for many, many years. And that problem is that whenever we want to spend on a progressive measure, we face the opposition of the right wing and the neoliberal centrists, who constantly ask the question, how are you going to pay for it? And who have instituted in Congress a pay-go system to try to ensure that there is payment for spending specified and tied to specific spending measures. And so what I'd like to ask you about is not only why you talk about paying for it all in that sense, when the taxes do not actually pay for it all. And I also would like to know how you would get by. The how you're going to pay for it, the question, which I'm sure you're already getting in your district somewhat, and you've been able to answer it in the way that you have answered me but tonight. But as things get tough in the election campaign, and as debates actually start, you'll have a neoliberal opponent who will be getting all kinds of information from the Clinton machine, or from the neoliberals within the Democratic Party, saying in very strong terms that you cannot possibly collect the taxes that you have to collect in order to pay for everything that you're meaning to legislate. Okay, so it seems to me it would be very valuable in that kind of situation, to be able to say something like, okay, well, I certainly do want to have various taxes that would drain money out of the economy to make room for federal spending on all of these programs. Okay, so we don't have inflation. And I'd also like to tax extremely heavily to level the playing field. But it isn't really necessary to have all these taxes to pay for everything. And there are some reasons why. The main reason is they don't actually pay for anything. Okay. But it's also true that we have to run deficits anyway, because we have trade deficits. And we also have enough people who want to save that we should be having 6% of GDP going to savings. So it's very likely that we actually will require a deficit of 12% a year anyway to keep the economy at full employment. Or you might have to say something like that. Okay, and you might also have to emphasize why taxes do not fund spending, or at least have some ready lines to say to make that sort of thing credible to people. So I know that's a lengthy question, and it's more like a lecture, okay, than actually a question. But I wanted to put, the dilemma to you, and then I wanted to inform you about something, okay, which may help, okay. But first, I'd like you to comment on that.
I mean, I don't think it's really a dilemma, because I think, as you recognize, the way one directs the tax burden has the possibilities of positively influencing the way in which the distribution of wealth in the nation affects our democracy, affects equal social opportunity, affects opportunity in families, and also affects economic growth. Because I think the more extreme the inequality in wealth is, the less of the aggregate wealth is actually being put back into productive investment. And so a system that not only taxes income, but taxes wealth. And wealth, after all, is about 5 to 6 times our national income. It's much more unevenly distributed. I think we do need to direct taxation at that. And, we can make a case for setting the amount as being equivalent to what these expenditures will be, both because it will meet the concerns of many, and because it is an amount that will help promote these other goals. Admittedly, we can finance government operations through deficit spending, through printing money, through various measures, right?
Okay.
And
well, first of all,
it's not clear that inflation is necessarily something that is a problem. It affects different parts of the economy in different ways, right? It obviously has a different impact upon those who are in debt and those who are creditors. And it's not itself an inherent evil. It depends upon other factors. The same thing with regard to deficits. There's
well, first of all,
problematic about a deficit, but it depends upon other relationships that pertain to it, I think.
Okay. But first of all, there's no printing money anymore.
Yeah. Well,
with respect to reserves, there's only the federal government, specifically the Federal Reserve, actually creating reserves.
Yeah.
Okay, which it creates high-powered reserves using the authority that Congress gave it.
Yeah.
And the first dollar the federal government spends is created that way. And the last dollar the government spends is also created that way. So there's no difference in how the money is created when the spending happens to be deficit spending than when the spending falls short of the taxes, okay, that are gathered. There's no difference. It's all created by the Federal Reserve by placing reserves in the Treasury spending account. So
but the amount of
it's not accurate to talk of printing. Okay. Okay, that's the first point. But the second point is, okay, that you cannot balance the budget and pay. I shouldn't even say pay for everything, but you cannot balance the budget, collect the same amount in taxes as you spend, okay, and maintain a full employment economy in the private sector, or perhaps I should say, and also prevent the downturn. And the reason why is because if you reach a full employment situation, okay, at first, we know from previous experience getting close to full employment that savings desires of the population will probably get to 6%, okay, of GDP. And that trading desires, okay, with Europe and China, okay, and other areas will increase to such a degree that the trade deficit will grow from the present roughly 3% to maybe 6%. So those are leakages of demand from the economy of altogether of 12% that have to be replaced by deficit spending to maintain full employment. So if you want to maintain full employment, there's no possibility of spending the same amount as you tax. You have to spend more than you tax, and you'll probably have to do it every single year until the savings desires and the trading desires actually change. Okay, but as long as they remain as they are now, it doesn't matter what Keynes said back in the 30s, it will be counterproductive to reduce the deficit. So you will have to do that, okay, for years and years.
Well, look, you're also admitting that one would not be reducing the deficit by having the kind of tax levels I'm referring to. And we have to think about, we're here speaking about a regime of guaranteed full employment, a regime in which there is employee empowerment. Many of these things are going to have an impact upon what kind of foreign trade we get involved in, what our economy is doing domestically as well as abroad. So I don't think it's a matter of dealing with the situation as it is and the dynamics that are inherent in the situation we find ourselves in. We're talking about measures that will transform much of this situation, many of these calculations.
Right, and I love those measures, and I agree they would transform the calculations. Okay, but I'd like to introduce you to a new method, okay, of financing, which even if you don't accept what I had to say about taxes not financing federal spending, will create a situation where taxes are seen certainly not to finance federal spending. And I'm going to put that up on the screen, but right now I have it in the I have it in the middle panel on the screen, if you can see that. Okay, and I'll try to put that in such a way. Let me see if I can get this better presented. I'm trying to get that expressed in a better way, but I'm not having a lot of luck right now. I'm trying to manipulate my choices here to get this, but I guess the best thing is what I had at first.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if I can hide myself at this point. Okay, and have you share the screen. You see,
yeah. I mean, I see it. You have something entitled "Create Overt Congressional Financing."
Okay, and the way that works, okay, is basically this: whenever Congress passes an appropriations bill,
yeah,
it contains something like this simple language on this particular slide. And what the language does is it does two things. It has Congress order the Fed to place in the Treasury spending account all the money the Treasury will have to spend to complete the appropriations that are mandated by Congress.
Yeah.
Okay, and it also requires the Federal Reserve to place in the Treasury account all the reserves that will be necessary to pay back all of the federal debt coming due during the period of the appropriation.
Yeah.
So the impact of making this an institutionalized thing in all the appropriations bills would be to guarantee federal funding from the first, to repay the national debt over time so that it was no longer a political issue without increasing taxes. Okay, and furthermore, to make very, very plain to people what is the actual truth now, and that is that taxes do not fund federal spending, but that according to the Constitution, the authority of Congress, now working through the Federal Reserve, funds spending, and that is the only institution, Congress is the only institution that under the authority of the Constitution can fund spending. And this would make it very plain to people that that actually goes on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wonder if you would consider this as perhaps a part of your platform, or if not a part of your platform, as something that you would commit to on the campaign trail, because this is the answer to how you're going to pay for it. It's kind of the ultimate answer. Okay, if this were passed, what it would do is that it would end the pay-go system in Congress. Just by doing this one thing, this simple thing, would end the pay-go system in Congress. And it would create a situation where the government would have to decide on what it wants to spend but first. And then it would have to pass special taxing bills for the express purpose of draining funds out of the economy to meet whatever the inflation constraint is judged to be at that time. So it would change the appropriations process.
I agree in general that the purpose of legislation as a legislative act should really be to establish standing rules governing, what are the goals that our government wants to achieve, and following what kind of rules. The determination of particular appropriations is really an executive matter. And it's really not part of the lawmaking capacity. So instead, if we're going to have legislation that pertains to what government is doing, as well as taxation, it's a matter of setting up the fundamental principles. As to what the particular appropriation should be, that's an administrative matter that can be handled both by the Federal Reserve and the IRS, as is necessary. And I think, indeed, we want to eliminate any situation where Congress can hold the country hostage, as they're doing, by refusing to allow, deficit ceilings to be established and appropriations to be made, et cetera. I mean, obviously that, no other countries allow that to happen.
Oh yeah, the debt limit is absolutely crazy. Of course, this would also get rid of the debt limit just by passing this language without ever repealing the law explicitly. This language would repeal it.
But I mean, this presents a kind of a form of operation, right? That, in a sense, you might say accurately describes what goes on. But on the other hand, I think there is a consideration that what the Federal Reserve is able to do has a relationship to the amount of wealth creation that the economy is generating, as well as the possibilities of taxation as well. It's not completely undetermined by those factors. It's not.
I agree. It's not completely undetermined at all by those factors. Okay, but what I also think is that the Constitution gives the Congress the authority over these matters. And there's a fundamental constitutional question in the first place as to whether Congress stepped outside of its authority under the Constitution in creating the Federal Reserve in the first place. Because the Federal Reserve is certainly an executive arm of government. All its functions, are executive. And according to the Constitution, there are only 3 branches of government, and the executive functions belong in the executive, which is not where they are now. That's an argument for folding the Federal Reserve into the Treasury Department. Okay, but by the way, it just happens to be so that kind of argument was consistent with a legal theory much favored by Justice Scalia, and that was the unitary executive theory. I know it's kind of ironic to. I'm sorry, I'm trying to show you here.
There may be a chief executive, but the executive has a plurality of branches. It's not as if they have to be all subsumed under a particular authority. But I think even when Congress has the right to deal with appropriations, it has a right to deal so in the sense of making law.
It not only has the right to deal with appropriations, it has the duty under the Constitution to do the spending. In other words, to do appropriations. Okay, so anyway, I wanted kind of to end on that particular note so that you heard that and would consider it. But I also, we only got through about half your platform today.
Yeah.
And I'd love for you to come back to talk about the other half.
Okay, I'd be more than happy to do so.
Okay.
Let me know when you'd like me to come back, and I definitely will be happy to take the opportunity.
Okay, if you'd like to come back 1 week from now again, same time, same station, I'd be happy to do it.
Let me just make sure that that's doable. So we're talking about the 8th. Yeah, I can do that. I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. So
make it a date?
Okay, let us make it a date. I'll be happy to have you come back for the 8th.
Look forward to it.
Okay. I would have a Q&A now, but we're at it for 1 hour and 43 minutes, and I don't want one of my 3-hour or 4-hour marathons to happen any longer. Okay, so thank you very much for coming, Richard.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for having this kind of discussion.
Okay.
Okay,
so I'll see you next week.
Yes. Okay, great. Take care.
Okay, take care. Okay, I am trying to end this. It doesn't happen instantly. Often. Sometimes.
I'll sign off on my camera. So good night, everyone.